First, I just want to thank those who have organized the conference. Thank you very much to Professors Kateryna Karpenko and Ruth Hagengruber. Und vielen Dank an die Universität Paderborn für die Ausrichtung dieser Veranstaltung. It's my great honor and privilege to participate in this conference with such an impressive group of international scholars and to have the opportunity to speak on this very important and timely topic of Russia's ecocide in Ukraine. So I want to start with this quote. The closing lines of Sasha Dovzhuk's recent CNN article is a fitting opening for my presentation. As Dovzhuk observes, although wars unfold in landscapes, and although control over landscapes is among the war's declared aims, one chiefly relies on human testimonies to document, expose, and interpret the war's effects. The destruction of a natural landscape is as much of a war crime as the destruction of human life. Like a human body, the body of a land can hurt, and for its agony, justice must be served. In what follows, I draw attention to some of Ukraine's environmental agony, discuss some of the key articles of international humanitarian and international criminal law vis-a-vis environmental harm during wartime, and analyze the history and meaning of ecocide, and then make a preliminary argument that Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka Dam constitutes an act of ecocide and should be treated and prosecuted as an international or an environmental war crime. One of the most horrific instances of environmental terrorism in the war to date is Russia's explosion of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam. Although there are many other catastrophic impacts related to this event, such as its effects on human health and well-being, the economy, energy, and nuclear safety, I describe only the consequences here to plant and wildlife, and my brief comments merely scratch the surface of the environmental destruction and long-term effects to Ukraine's biotic communities and ecosystem. A report by the Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group states that the Kakhovka Reservoir was the habitat for around 43 fish species. According to current estimates, it will take a minimum of 7 to 10 years for the fish stocks to be restored, as the areas where fish reproduce and the primary bodies of water where they live have been completely devastated and rendered uninhabitable. With the destruction of the fish population, it is likely that the vast majority of all living organisms that inhabited the Kakhovka Reservoir will also die. Because of the cataclysmic decrease of the water level in the reservoir, aquatic and riparian plants, that is, plants that grow along the banks of the river and other bodies of water of this Kakhovka Reservoir, will disappear, and invasive or non-native plants will displace them, thus further negatively impacting biodiversity and the ecosystem. In addition to the fish population, the bird population has also suffered. Within the flood zone, crucial nesting sites for water and shorebird species have been destroyed, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of individual birds. Additionally, the lower Dnipro floodplains, which house the largest colonies of herons and other colonial birds in the region, have been severely impacted by this catastrophic event. Birds and their fledglings have experienced extensive harm and devastation during their nesting period. Unfortunately, there is insufficient time for the establishment of new colonies and subsequent breeding. Consequently, bird species, including herons, terns, ducks, rails, moorhens, and mute swans, will lose their nesting colonies. It is anticipated that their populations can recover. However, this will likely take again 3 to 7 years. Additionally, Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka Dam has significant negative consequences for numerous nature preserves and protected areas in Ukraine. A considerable portion of the affected region located within the flood zone holds national and international nature protection status. Approximately 47 national protected areas, including notable sites such as the Black Sea Biosphere Reserve, National Nature Parks Ivory Coast of Sviatoslav, Lower Dnipro, Oleshki Sands, and 7 Emerald Network sites have been impacted in various degrees of severity by this flooding. The Black Sea Biosphere Reserve has been under protection since 1927 and is recognized as part of the UNESCO World Network of Biosphere Reserves. The total area of flooded protected sites could well exceed 120,000 hectares. So what I want to do now is just briefly talk a little bit about the history or kind of genealogy of this concept of ecocide. And I want to do that to talk about how ecocide is understood in current international law, and then highlight some of the problems with current international legal articulations of ecocide. The creation of the term ecocide is often attributed to Arthur Galston, who was a biologist and a professor at Yale University. Galston was outraged at the US military's use of defoliants such as Agent Orange, Agent White, and Agent Blue during the Vietnam War. The use of these chemical substances as environmental weapons destroyed around 20,000 square kilometers of forests and cultivatable land and 500,000 hectares of mangroves, in total, almost 20% of the total territory of South Vietnam. The Agent Orange that was used contained dioxin, which is an extremely toxic chemical. In addition to the immediate destruction of the environment, dioxin has long-term effects on nature, and 30 years after its introduction, it remains present in the food chain. This horrific and excessive environmental destruction moved Galston to attend a conference on war and national responsibility in Washington, D.C. in February of 1970. And there he attempted to rally the international community to ban ecocide, understood at that time simply as the willful destruction of the environment. The US military's use of defoliants in the Vietnam War has been largely recognized as an act of ecocide by international scholars. However, neither the US military nor any of its commanding officers have been legally charged or prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. Richard Falk further developed Galston's notion of ecocide, and in 1973, he put forward what he called an International Convention on the Crime of Ecocide. Falk was also outraged over the US military's environmental destruction in Vietnam and the lack of justice for its human and ecological victims. Thus, he proposed an ecocide convention to criminalize environmental destruction. As he explains, quote, "Just as the Genocide Convention came along to formalize part of what had already been condemned and punished at Nuremberg, so an ecocide convention could help carry forward into the future a legal condemnation of environmental warfare," end quote. The multiple attempts to criminalize ecocide have unfortunately been unsuccessful. Debates dating back to 1984 and which continue to this day as to whether ecocide should be included in the list of international core crimes, namely the crimes of ecocide, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Efforts to make ecocide an internationally recognized crime prosecutable by international criminal law courts face multiple challenges. Like all international law, international criminal law constrains states. However, in contrast with international trade law, state sovereignty constraints with the material benefits of international cooperation, international criminal law has high costs, including the possibility of prosecuting and incarcerating state nationals. Moreover, the benefits of international criminal law are not perceived as producing immediate material and economic benefits, but rather as having merely symbolic benefits and promoting ethical ideals that are not easily quantifiable. For example, the promise of building a more peaceful and just international community. Consequently, obtaining support for the criminalization of any act in international law is quite challenging because it requires persuading states of the normative value of that act. Sadly, economic benefit to government and corporate actors is often seen as more valuable than promoting international peace and justice, as well as promoting and defending the well-being of the environment. As we will see, a fundamental shift in thinking concerning how we understand the natural environment, which is then reflected in the legal terminology, is required. More specifically, a paradigm shift is needed in which the environment and non-human life are seen as goods in themselves. That is, they have inherent value worth protecting, and at the same time, protecting their well-being is intimately tied to our own well-being. This more than human mindset must then replace the current linguistic formulations of international law, which state that the environment, ecosystems, and more than human life are goods only insofar as they benefit or provide pleasure for humans. In short, we need a more than human understanding that sees human and ecological flourishing as interrelated goods worth protecting. Such a view would then make possible an ecocentric rather than an anthropocentric definition of ecocide. So on this slide, I have several articles that are very important, and I will talk about them in the order that you see them on the slide. So first of all, there's no single agreed upon definition of ecocide in academic scholarship or in international law. In broad terms, ecocide refers to the destruction of ecosystems and the species they support on a massive scale. The definitions of the term vary, but in all cases, they contain the widespread killing or degradation of nature. Even though in international law and international criminal law today, the term ecocide is absent, one could argue that key components of the concept are nonetheless present. As many environmental scholars have noted, current international criminal law limits the criminalization of ecocide to the context of war. I agree with the critics that the crime of ecocide should be extended to peacetime. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus only on wartime contexts with a specific view to the present war in Ukraine and the massive environmental harms that Russia has carried out. So let's begin with a brief overview of the crucial articles in international law and international criminal law that pertain to the fundamental aspect of the concept of ecocide. The Environmental Modification Convention, which is I'm going to refer to as ENMOD, this became effective on October 5th, 1978, was the first international convention to address large-scale environmental destruction during wartime. Article 1.1 of ENMOD states, quote, each state party to this convention undertakes not to engage in military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques having widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects as the means of destruction, damage, or inquiry to any other state party, end quote. As we will discuss shortly, Article 1.1 of ENMOD is especially important to the environmental justice movement because its inclusion of the qualifiers widespread, long-term, and severe to describe the effects of the environmental harm have often served as the basis for articulating a definition of environmental harm in international law. The next noteworthy environmental protection law applicable during wartime is the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. Here, the relevant articles are Article 35.3 and Article 55.1. Article 35.3 appears in the section of the protocol that concerns the methods and means of warfare and states the following, quote, it is prohibited to employ methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. Article 55.1 falls under the broader heading of the protection of civilians in wartime and states, quote, care shall be taken in wartime to protect the natural environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage. This protection includes a prohibition of the use of methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause such damage to the natural environment and thereby to prejudice the health or survival of the population, end quote. And then lastly, we have the very important Rome Statute. This became effective in 2002 and serves as the principal legal framework in international criminal law. And that's very important because it's the only one of those that are presented on the screen that have to do with international criminal law. Here, the crucial article is Article 8.2b.4, which forbids, quote, intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such an attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, or widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated, end quote. So here, what I'd like to do now is to offer a few observations about each article and to note some of their positive aspects as well as some of their shortcomings. Article 35.3 is a positive development in international environmental law. Why? Well, because it's formulated in an ecocentric manner. That is, it presents the natural environment as an intrinsic good and worthy of protection as such. In contrast, Article 55.1 is formulated in an anthropocentric way, making harm to the natural environment problematic only insofar as it negatively impacts the health, well-being, or survival of human beings. Article 55.1 and Article 8.2b.4 also repeat the language of Article 1.1 of NMOD, namely these terms widespread, long-term, and severe, which you're going to hear me repeat over and over. You'll probably never forget these qualifiers. However, unlike Article 1.1 of NMOD, which uses the disjunctive or, they employ a conjunctive and, which means that all three of these conditions must be met in order to constitute a violation of the protocol. Moreover, many scholars have criticized the ambiguity of several terms in the articles, noting that such ambiguity could create loopholes for combatants to justify their destructive actions. Since Article 8.2b.4 is the only article that presently exists within international criminal law, it is worth highlighting a few points in relation to it. First, Article 8.2b.4 does not necessitate actual environmental harm or destruction. The act of initiating an attack with the knowledge that it will cause such damage is sufficient to render the conduct of a criminal offense. Moreover, the natural environment need not be the direct attack or the direct target of the attack. Lastly, the repeated uses of the disjunctive or establishes individual criminal responsibility for attacks that generate widespread, long-term, and severe environmental damage, regardless of whether harm is caused to the civilian population. For these reasons, Article 8.2b.4 is the first international criminal law that articulates a war crime in ecocentric terms. However, scholars have also identified shortcomings of Article 8.2b.4. Namely, it does not cover environmental harm and destruction that occurs in peacetime, such as the negligent management of nuclear power plants and disposing of chemical wastes, oil, or other toxic substances in the ocean. Furthermore, it applies only to international armed conflict, despite the damage which internal conflicts could cause to the environment. Okay, so moving to the next screen here. Scholars and experts in environmental law have in recent years attempted to address some of the shortcomings of current international criminal law, and especially with respect to these, to environmental harm and ecocide. So in June 2021, a panel of independent experts crafted and presented a draft document focused on the crime of ecocide. They likewise proposed that ecocide be included in the Rome Statute as the fifth core crime against peace, along with genocide, Article 6, crimes against humanity, Article 7, war crimes, Article 8, and crimes of aggression, which is called Article 8 bis, or the second Article 8. So ecocide would then constitute a new third Article 8, the so-called Article 8 ter, or TER. The independent expert panel facilitated by the Stop Ecocide Foundation consisted of 12 international members with expertise in human rights and environmental and criminal law. In June of 2021, following months of deliberation, the panel put forth the following legal definition for the crime of ecocide. Quote, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts, end quote. It's clear that we need a more robust and holistic definition of ecocide that is significantly broader in scope than our existing international and humanitarian laws. and which present the natural environment, non-human life, and ecosystems as inherent goods worth protecting. The 2021 International Expert Panel's definition of ecocide is indeed broader in scope than Article 8 2b4, since the former includes the criminalization of ecocide in peacetime. However, it too is not without its shortcomings. Like the other articles, elements of its language is problematic. So, for example, the requirement that an attack must be carried out in the knowledge that such an attack will result in widespread, long-term, and severe harm to the natural environment potentially raises the bar too high in terms of proving culpability and may create interpretive loopholes. Likewise, the definition's wording creates a cost-benefit analysis option in which the social and economic benefits of an action can be weighed against the actions of environmental harm. The inclusion of a cost-benefit analysis in the proposed third Article 8 perpetuates the flawed assumption that the welfare of the environment and the welfare of human beings are separate, when in truth they are both goods that are intimately interconnected and worth protecting. So at this point, I'm going to try to make an argument, make a case, at least preliminary argument against Russia, that is, that they, in fact, committed ecocide in Ukraine. So here in this final part of my presentation, I indicate how Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka Dam constitutes an act of ecocide. Since Article 8 2b4 is the only statute currently in force in international criminal law, its shortcomings notwithstanding, I will make my argument within its present framework. As we recall, Article 8 2b4 prohibits, quote, intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to the civilian objects or widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the natural environment, clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. The first point worth underscoring is that the Russian military combatants were the ones who have occupied the Kakhovka Dam since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. In other words, since February 24th, 2022. Moreover, since mid-October 2022, President Zelensky had publicly warned that Russian troops had mined the dam and were planning to carry out a terrorist attack, which they would then blame on Ukraine, and they did. Current evidence includes that an explosive charge was detonated within a small passageway or gallery inside the dam, which was accessible from the dam's machine room. Experts who study dam failures argue that it is highly unlikely that the failure of the dam's underlying foundation would occur as a result of the previous damage that the dam had suffered. So, for example, the Russians had actually detonated an explosion in November of 2022, but that explosion simply destroyed a roadway directly above the structure's northern end. The destruction of the dam's foundation, such as occurred on June 6, 2023, would require an extremely powerful explosive device. And according to Michael W. West, a geotechnical engineer and an expert in dam safety and failure analysis, the perfect location to place an explosive charge was precisely within the passageway that I just mentioned. The collapse of an entire section of the dam strongly indicates that an extremely powerful explosion took place. In fact, seismic sensors detected signals from blasts early in the morning on June 6, 2023. In a New York Times investigative report from June 16, 2023, Dr. Ben Dondo, a seismologist at the Norwegian organization NORSAR, which specializes in seismology and seismic monitoring, affirmed that, quote, the seismic signals were picked up on two sensors, one in Romania and one in Ukraine, and occurred at 2:35 a.m. and 2:54 a.m. Ukrainian time, end quote. The explosions registered almost a magnitude 2 on the Norwegian monitors, which confirms that this was a massive explosion. As an article published on June 18, 2023 by the Associated Press explains, The Kakhovka Dam is part of a group of dams constructed during the Soviet era along the Dnieper River. These dams were designed to withstand massive forces equivalent to thousands of pounds of explosives. The dams were built following the well-known dam busters raids during World War II, which targeted and destroyed German dams. In short, evidence strongly indicates that subsequent to detonations from deep within the dam, a massive release of water from the reservoir occurred, resulting in widespread flooding in southern Ukraine. Since Russian combatants controlled the dam, they had access to the passageway and could have easily placed a massive explosive device within it. The Ukrainian military, in contrast, had no access to the passageway. In terms of potential motives for destroying the dam, Russian deliberations for detonating the dam can be reasonably construed to include the belief and expectation that such an act would achieve military advantages for their side. That is, Russia might reasonably expect that their destruction of the dam and subsequent flooding of the area would hinder the Ukrainian counteroffensive, as this would make an attack on the Kherson region extremely difficult and would make it virtually impossible for Ukrainian troops to use a pontoon bridge to cross the Dnieper River. To intentionally destroy a dam of this size for presumed military advantages, including those just mentioned, involves the expectation, awareness, and one could argue, knowledge that subsequent flooding and its consequences will cause mass devastation, harm, and even destruction to the human inhabitants of the area, as well as to biotic life, ecosystems, and the entire natural environment. In short, the facts, evidence, and reasoning presented thus far point to the Russians as the responsible party that intentionally destroyed the Kakhovka Dam, with the expectation and knowledge that such an action would cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects. Okay, this is my final slide. So here in the final section, I argue that Russia's destruction of the dam also caused widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, and that this damage is clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. And here I'm going to repeat some of the figures that I gave you earlier in the presentation. And although I thought about not repeating those, not having them in the beginning, I think it's really important to say them twice, to just try to let it sink in terms of how bad the destruction actually is. So, as noted earlier in this presentation, the Kakhovka Reservoir housed over 40 fish species. Given the vast destruction of the area where the fish live and reproduce, it's estimated to take at least 7 to 10 years for the fish stocks to be restored. The devastation of the fish population will give rise to a loss of most of the living organisms that inhabited the Kakhovka Reservoir, and the significant decrease in the water level will result in the disappearance of aquatic and riparian plants along the reservoir's banks, as well as the appearance of invasive alien plants. And this will create further adverse effects on biodiversity and the ecosystem. Additionally, the bird population in the affected area has likewise experienced significant devastation and harm, including the deaths, again, of tens of thousands of individual birds. The nesting colonies for several bird species have been significantly harmed or destroyed, and it's estimated that it will take many of the bird groupings 3 to 7 years to recover. In view of the deaths of thousands of individual fish, plants, birds, and other living organisms, as well as the extensive harm to the area's biodiversity and ecosystems, Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka Dam constitutes an act of severe environmental harm, that is, ecocide. As noted earlier, this devastation will have long-term effects, as both the fish and bird population will require multiple years to be restored, between 3 to 7 years. And lastly, flooding resulting from the dam's rupture has significantly harmed several nature preserves and protected areas in Ukraine. Approximately 47 nationally protected areas have been impacted by the flooding, and the total area of flooded protected sites is estimated to exceed 120,000 hectares. And to put that into perspective, 120,000 hectares would be roughly equivalent to the land areas of Paderborn, Berlin, and Dresden combined, which is, and it's actually slightly more because those three cities together would be about 117,000 hectares. So this again would highlight the widespread environmental damage caused by Russia. So the harm, devastation, and resultant destruction of life caused by Russia's heinous act that I've outlined and discussed in this presentation is only part of the nightmare that is reality, which continues to unfold in Russia's cruel and unjust war against Ukraine's people, culture, non-human animals, and natural environment. And one could say against everything that lives and moves and has its being in Ukraine. To quote again Sasha Dovzhuk's poignant words, "The destruction of a natural landscape is as much of a war crime as the destruction of human life. Like a human body, the body of a land can hurt, and for its agony, justice must be served." Thank you very much.